A child's laughter once filled this home, soft giggles, tiny footsteps running through the halls. But one night, that laughter stopped. Forever. What investigators found inside would shake an entire community to its core. It was a case that would leave even the most seasoned detectives questioning how such unimaginable cruelty could exist within the walls of a family home. A mother, a boyfriend, and a little girl who never stood a chance. Her name was Evangelina Wing. She was 2 years old. And the people who were supposed to love her became the ones she needed protection from the most. Seaside, Oregon. A coastal town known for its boardwalk, its quiet neighborhoods, the salty breeze that drifts through its streets. But on December 20, 2014, a chilling discovery turned a simple apartment into the scene of one of Oregon's most brutal child abuse cases. This wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was a failure of a system meant to protect its most vulnerable. And it would leave people asking the same haunting question. How did this happen? And why didn't anyone stop it? The truth would only come to light after it was too late. This is the story of Evangelina Wing and the case that forced Oregon to re-examine its child protection laws. Do you think the justice system truly protects children? Let us know in the comments. Before we go deeper into the story, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Evangelina Wing was just 2 years old. She had barely begun to experience the world, her small hands reaching for everything with wonder, her laughter bright and infectious. She was a child who should have had a lifetime ahead of her, a future filled with bedtime stories, birthday candles, and days spent playing in the sun. But for Evangelina, childhood was nothing like that. It was brief. And it was filled with pain. She lived in Seaside, Oregon, a small coastal town known for its picturesque views and quiet streets. Tourists often visited to enjoy the boardwalk and the sound of waves crashing along the shore. But beyond the charm of the town, inside a modest apartment, a very different reality existed. Evangelina lived with her mother, Dorothy Wing, and her mother's boyfriend, Randy Lee Roden. From a distance, they looked like any other family. A young mother trying to make ends meet. A boyfriend who had taken on a role in her children's lives. A home where kids played. Where laughter should have been heard. But that illusion was just that, an illusion. Behind closed doors, something was terribly wrong. There were signs, whispers of concern that never turned into action. Neighbors had noticed things. The way Evangelina's cries sometimes carried through the walls. The way Dorothy had seemed distant, distracted. The way Randy moved through the apartment, his presence unsettling to those who caught glimpses of him. There were bruises, small at first, barely noticeable. Excuses followed, children fall, they bump into things. But the explanations never quite matched what people saw. 2 weeks before Evangelina was found lifeless, an anonymous tip was made to Child Protective Services. Someone had seen enough to be concerned. A warning was given. A call was made, but it was not enough. No one came. No one stepped in. And 2 weeks later, a little girl who had once smiled so easily would never smile again. The system that was supposed to protect children like Evangelina failed her. She was invisible to those who could have saved her. And by the time the truth came to light, it was no longer a question of intervention, it was a question of justice. Should Child Protection Services be held accountable for missed warning signs? The night of December 20, 2014, was cold in Seaside, Oregon. A slight mist rolled in from the Pacific, settling over the quiet streets. The lights in the apartment complex flickered dimly as families settled in for the night. For most, it was just another evening. But inside one of those units, something terrible was happening. Evangelina Wing, just 2 years old, was inside with her mother, Dorothy Wing, and her mother's boyfriend, Randy Lee Roden. The household had been tense for days, maybe even longer. But no one outside those walls knew just how bad things had become. That night, a neighbor heard something, a faint sound, muffled, barely noticeable at first. It was a cry, sharp and short-lived, followed by something worse. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that signals a sleeping child. This was different. Something felt wrong. No one knocked on the door. No one called for help. And as the minutes passed, that silence remained. By the time first responders arrived at the apartment, the air inside was still and heavy. The moment they stepped in, they knew something wasn't right. The apartment wasn't in disarray. There were no broken objects, no sign of a struggle. Everything was exactly where it should have been, except for one thing. Evangelina. She was found inside one of the rooms, small and fragile, her body still. The room itself told its own story. There were toys scattered across the floor, untouched. A blanket lay crumpled in the corner, a small stuffed animal beside it. But there was no warmth in that space. No sign of the life that should have been there. Evangelina's body was covered in bruises. Some old, some fresh, some small, others large enough to show the full extent of what she had endured. There was no explanation that could justify what had been done to her. The damage was undeniable. And there was no doubt, this had not been an accident. As the paramedics moved through the scene, there was something else that struck them. The reactions of the two adults in the apartment. Dorothy, Evangelina's own mother, was standing nearby. But she wasn't frantic. She wasn't screaming, or crying, or begging them to save her daughter. Instead, she seemed distant. Detached. Randy was the same. There was no panic, no sign of remorse. They weren't clinging to each other in grief. They weren't asking what had happened or how things had come to this. They were just, there. When the officers asked what had happened, the answers were inconsistent. Dorothy said one thing. Randy said another. Neither story aligned with what was in front of them. Neither of them could explain why Evangelina looked the way she did. Why she was covered in bruises. Why she had been left alone in that room, unresponsive, as if her life hadn't just been taken. It didn't take long for the authorities to realize that something was very wrong. A child's life had been stolen in the very place where she should have been safest. And the two people who should have protected her were standing there, showing no sign of devastation, no sign of loss. The question that lingered was one that would haunt everyone who would come to know Evangelina's story. If you heard a child crying in distress, would you intervene? Why or why not? The investigation into the death of 2-year-old Evangelina Wing began immediately. Authorities knew from the moment they stepped inside the apartment that this was no tragic accident. The bruises on her small body told a story far different from what her mother, Dorothy Wing, and her mother's boyfriend, Randy Lee Roden, were claiming. This wasn't an isolated injury. This wasn't a momentary lapse in supervision. This was the result of sustained, prolonged abuse. The first step for investigators was establishing a timeline. When was the last time anyone had seen Evangelina alive and well? Who had contact with her in the days leading up to her death? Was there any indication that something was wrong before that fatal night? What they found was disturbing. Evangelina hadn't been taken to a doctor in months. Not for a routine checkup. Not for an injury. Not even when it was clear that she had been suffering. There were no medical records to explain the bruises, the marks, the signs that her small body had been subjected to repeated trauma. The lack of medical care wasn't an oversight. It was evidence of neglect. And it was only the beginning. The coroner's report confirmed what investigators had already suspected: Evangelina's injuries were not the result of a single incident. The bruises, in different stages of healing, indicated that this had been happening for weeks, possibly months. Some were faint, barely noticeable. Others were severe, deep under the skin, signs of forceful impact. And then there was the final injury, the one that ended her life. A blow to the head, strong enough to cause fatal trauma. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. The detectives turned to Dorothy first. As Evangelina's mother, she was the one person who should have protected her. The one person who should have known exactly what had happened. Instead, her responses were vague. She claimed she didn't know. She said Evangelina had been fine. That she hadn't noticed anything wrong. But her words didn't match the reality. How could she not have known? How could she have lived in the same home and not seen what was happening to her own child? Randy, on the other hand, denied everything. He said he had no idea how Evangelina had been injured. He said he hadn't hurt her, but his history said otherwise. Randy had a criminal past, one that involved violence. This wasn't a man with a clean record. This was someone who had been in and out of trouble, someone who had already shown a pattern of aggression. And now, a child was dead under his roof. As investigators dug further, more disturbing details emerged. The injuries weren't just evidence of neglect, they were proof of a pattern. The abuse had escalated over time. It had started with smaller bruises, things that might have gone unnoticed. But as time passed, it had grown worse. The signs were all there, but no one had stepped in. The anonymous call to Child Protective Services 2 weeks earlier took on new significance. Someone had seen enough to report it. Someone had suspected that the children in that home were in danger. But nothing had been done. And now, Evangelina was gone. The blood evidence in the apartment raised even more questions. Some of it was fresh, tied to the injury that had killed her. But there were also older traces. Evidence that she had bled before. That she had been hurt, over and over again. There was no doubt anymore. Evangelina's death was not a sudden, unforeseen tragedy. It was the end of a long, horrifying pattern of abuse. And the two people who should have stopped it, her mother and her mother's boyfriend, had done nothing. As investigators built their case, the focus shifted to accountability. Who had failed Evangelina? Was it just Dorothy and Randy? Or did the system itself bear some of the blame? Should someone who fails to report child abuse be charged as an accomplice? Tell us what you think. Dorothy Wing was 24 years old. A mother of 3, a woman who, by all accounts, should have been the first line of defense for her children. Yet, when investigators questioned her about what had happened to Evangelina, she gave nothing. No real explanations. No outrage. No grief that could be considered natural for a mother who had just lost a child in such a horrific way. Instead, her words were vague, detached. She claimed she didn't know what had happened. That everything had been fine. That there was no reason to believe her daughter was in danger. But nothing about her story made sense. Dorothy had stayed with Randy Lee Roden despite every sign that she should have left. He wasn't a safe man. He wasn't someone who should have been around children. And yet, she had allowed him into their lives, into their home. Those closest to her had seen the warning signs. Her relationship with Randy was anything but stable. He was controlling. He had a past, one filled with aggression, outbursts, and trouble with the law. And yet, Dorothy had stayed. She had chosen him over her own daughter's safety. The question investigators struggled with was one that would divide public opinion. Was Dorothy a victim of an abusive relationship, trapped and too afraid to act? Or had she been complicit? Did she know what was happening and simply choose to ignore it? There was no denying that Dorothy had made bad choices. She had allowed Evangelina to live in a dangerous environment. She had ignored the injuries, the bruises, the clear evidence that something was wrong. But the most disturbing part of all was that she hadn't just allowed Randy to stay in their lives. She had enabled him. Dorothy wasn't the one who had inflicted the fatal injuries. She wasn't the one who had struck the blow that ended her daughter's life. But her silence, her refusal to act, had made her just as responsible. When investigators questioned Randy, his reaction was chilling. No remorse. No panic. No sorrow. He wasn't trying to plead his case or convince anyone of his innocence. His answers were short, dismissive. He denied everything, even when the evidence against him was overwhelming. How does a man like that end up in a home with young children? How does someone with a history of violence get a chance to repeat it? The system had failed Evangelina long before that final night. It had failed her the moment it allowed a man like Randy to be near her. It had failed her the moment Dorothy had chosen to ignore the danger. Some believed that Dorothy had been a victim in her own way. That she had been controlled, manipulated, too afraid to act. Others saw her as just as guilty as Randy, because she had stayed, because she had done nothing, because she had let her child suffer while she turned away. Do you believe Dorothy was afraid to leave, or was she just as guilty? Let us know your opinion. The trial of Randy Lee Roden and Dorothy Wing began in a courtroom filled with tension so heavy it was almost suffocating. The case had shocked Seaside, Oregon, and as the proceedings unfolded, the outrage in the community only grew stronger. People who had never even met Evangelina felt the weight of what had happened to her. Her death was no longer just a tragic loss, it was a symbol of a system that had failed to act, a justice system that was now being tested in its ability to hold those responsible accountable. The prosecution did not hold back. They painted a chilling picture of what had taken place inside that apartment, showing the jury images of Evangelina's bruised and battered body. They brought forward medical experts who confirmed that her injuries had been sustained over a long period of time, that this was not the result of one tragic night but of months of suffering. This was a pattern, not an accident. Their goal was clear, they wanted Randy Lee Roden locked away for life. He had inflicted pain on a child, he had taken her life, and he had shown no remorse. They wanted the maximum sentence possible, ensuring that he would never be free to hurt another innocent soul. Dorothy Wing, however, was a different case. The prosecutors knew they had enough evidence to show that she had allowed this to happen, that she had failed to protect her daughter. But proving her guilt in Evangelina's actual death was more complicated. She hadn't delivered the fatal blow. She hadn't physically assaulted her daughter. What she had done, or rather, what she hadn't done, was turn a blind eye to the abuse. The defense attorneys took a different approach. Randy's legal team tried to argue that his actions were not premeditated. That he had simply lost control. That he had acted out of frustration rather than true intent to harm. It was a desperate strategy, one that was unlikely to gain sympathy, but they had little else to work with. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony from experts left no doubt. The bruises, the trauma, the blood, these were not the signs of a single moment of anger. They were the results of sustained, methodical abuse. Dorothy's defense took another route. They painted her as a woman trapped in an abusive relationship. They argued that she had been controlled, manipulated, too afraid to act. That she had stayed with Randy out of fear rather than neglect. That she had been powerless to stop what was happening. In the end, Dorothy took a plea deal. She admitted guilt, but only to manslaughter. She would not face trial for murder. Instead, her sentence would be reduced in exchange for her cooperation. For the jury, the decision on Randy Lee Roden was straightforward. He was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to 35 years in prison. It was a lengthy sentence, but for many, it still wasn't enough. There was no sentence that could undo what he had done. No amount of time behind bars that could make up for the life he had stolen. Dorothy Wing's sentence, however, was met with outrage. The plea deal meant that she would serve only 15 years. To some, it was a miscarriage of justice. She had failed to protect her daughter. She had ignored the signs. She had made the choice to stay, to allow Randy to remain in their lives. And now, after 15 years, she would walk free. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some believed she had been a victim herself, that she had suffered in silence, afraid to leave. Others saw her as just as guilty as Randy, arguing that she had willingly allowed the abuse to continue. Did the justice system fail Evangelina? Did Dorothy deserve a longer sentence? Should she have been charged with murder? Comment your thoughts below. The sentencing of Randy Lee Roden and Dorothy Wing may have marked the end of the trial, but for the town of Seaside, Oregon, it was far from over. Evangelina Wing's death was not something people could easily forget. Her absence lingered in the quiet streets, in the empty spaces where she once played, in the faces of those who had unknowingly passed by a child in distress without realizing just how much she needed help. The community was shaken. This was not a large city where crime was expected, where tragedies faded into the headlines only to be replaced by another the next day. This was a small town, a place where people knew each other, where neighbors exchanged greetings in passing, where children rode their bikes along the sidewalks, watched by those who believed their town was safe. But safety had failed Evangelina. The people who should have protected her, her mother, Child Protective Services, the very system designed to intervene in cases like hers, had not done enough. In the days following the sentencing, people gathered. They stood outside in the cold with candles in their hands, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow as they mourned a child they would never get to see grow up. There were photos of Evangelina placed near flowers, stuffed animals left as silent tributes to a little girl who had been denied the chance to hold them again. People whispered prayers, some held back tears, and others simply stood in silence, unable to put into words the weight of what had happened. For many, grief turned into action. Evangelina's story could not be allowed to repeat itself. Child abuse awareness campaigns gained momentum. Advocates pushed for stricter intervention policies, demanding that warnings like the anonymous call to DHS be taken more seriously. No longer could reports of abuse be dismissed as overreactions. No longer could bureaucracy stand in the way of saving a life. The case forced Oregon to re-examine its child welfare policies. Lawmakers and social workers studied the failures that had allowed Evangelina to slip through the cracks. More stringent intervention procedures were introduced, ensuring that when a report of suspected abuse was made, it would not be ignored. DHS workers were now expected to respond with greater urgency, to follow up on cases that might have previously been dismissed. There would be no second chances to save a child's life. For Evangelina's surviving siblings, the effects of what had happened would last far beyond the courtroom, beyond the new policies and public outcry. They were young, too young to fully grasp what had happened to their sister, but the trauma would remain with them. The scars of what they had seen, of what they had endured, would not disappear with time. They had lived in the same home, had been subjected to the same neglect. Though they had survived, they would carry the weight of that experience with them for the rest of their lives. The tragedy of Evangelina's death served as a reminder of the responsibility that every person has to protect the vulnerable, a reminder that when something seems wrong, it is not enough to assume someone else will step in. Too many people had seen the signs. Too many people hesitated, and in the end, it had cost a child her life. What do you think should change in child protection laws to prevent future tragedies like this? Let us know in the comments. A child's life was stolen. A future that should have been filled with love, laughter, and the innocence of childhood was instead cut short by the very people who should have protected her. Evangelina Wing never had the chance to grow up, to run through the playground without fear, to experience the warmth of a home where she was truly safe. Her life ended in a place where she should have been protected the most, by the hands of those who should have cherished her. Her story is not just about the crime that took her away. It is about the silence that allowed it to happen. The missed opportunities to intervene. The anonymous tip that went unanswered. The bruises that were overlooked. The reports that were dismissed. It is about a system that failed her at every turn. And it is about the question that remains, how many more children will suffer before real change happens? This case should have been a turning point. It should have been a lesson that no cry for help should ever be ignored, that no warning sign should ever be brushed aside. Yet, even after Evangelina, even after the vigils and the outrage and the promises to do better, cases like hers continue to surface. Children continue to suffer in homes where they are supposed to be safe. calls to Child Protective Services are still left without urgent action. And the cycle continues. Was justice truly served? Randy Lee Roden received 35 years for his crimes, but was it enough? Evangelina is gone forever, while he will one day walk free. Dorothy Wing, the woman who should have protected her, received only 15 years. She will one day be able to move on, to start a new life, while Evangelina's life was stolen before it had even begun. Should she have faced a harsher sentence? Should she have been charged with murder, not just manslaughter? Or was she truly a victim, trapped in a situation she felt she could not escape? Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had spoken up sooner? The neighbors who heard muffled cries but hesitated. The relatives who suspected something was wrong but didn't want to interfere. The Child Protective Services worker who received the call but did not act quickly enough. Who, in the end, was responsible for Evangelina's fate? Was it only the two people who stood in that apartment the night she died, or was it a failure much larger than that? If you believe stories like Evangelina's need to be told, subscribe. Because silence is deadly. Spread awareness. Share this video. One voice can make a difference. Her story is over. But it doesn't have to be forgotten.